something that I said several times last year during the election was that I thought that Trump would find a way to somehow be even worse than Biden on Israel-Palestine. And a lot of people, let's be clear, this is a totally reasonable and understandable reaction. A lot of people said, how could he possibly be worse? Some people even pin their hopes on the desperate gamble that somehow despite some of the things he was saying, he might actually be better. And hey, the Israelis did give him a ceasefire as a kind of housewarming gift for assuming office, the same way that they gave Obama one in 2009. Look it up, by the way. In 2009, there was after the 2008-2009 Gaza war, there was a ceasefire that started on January 18th, 2 days before Barack Obama took office. And famously, the Israelis didn't even like Obama, right? Even before he really started pissing them off with stuff like the Iran deal. Trump, they love. He's the guy who unilaterally tore up the Iran detente, who moved the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem after several decades of presidents from both parties not wanting to certify Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem by doing that, who started referring to the West Bank in official documents as Judea and Samaria, who officially dropped the official U.S. position that the settlements were illegal, not mind you that this position was doing the Palestinians, the West Bank any good, but that's what the official position had been since there had been settlements, and Trump was the one who dropped it. And during the debate with Biden, in between Biden's brains dribbling out of his mouth, Trump actually accused Biden of having become Palestinian, a bad Palestinian. He also said that Chuck Schumer had become Palestinian. So Netanyahu wagered that he was going to get a lot more out of Trump than he would out of Biden. And he held off on taking a ceasefire deal that had been on the table for several months so he could give it as a housewarming present to Donald Trump. I'm not saying that's all that was going on. There were all kinds of reports of Trump himself offering both carrots and sticks to Netanyahu so he'd have the diplomatic accomplishment to hold up at the outset of his presidency. But I do think it's a lot of what was going on. And while I'm obviously hoping for the best, how long the ceasefire holds is anyone's guess. To the extent that it even is holding, the IDF has already been interpreting ceasefire in pretty creative ways, and we could be back to all-out shooting war at any time. So if you'd asked me last year what I thought would happen in that scenario, I would have said Trump does the same thing as Biden, but a little bit worse. During the election, he accused Biden of holding Netanyahu back and said that we should do the opposite. And there have already been signs of that. Trump ended Biden's pause on 2,000-pound bombs, for example. So that all fits with what I would have expected last year and what I talked about in the video I did just before the election. But Trump has actually found a way to float an idea that's about 1,000 times worse than what I was expecting. When Netanyahu visited him, Trump said, let's roll the clip of what he said.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
Got that? Whatever wasn't destroyed in those 15 months of carpet bombing, whatever is left standing, the U.S. will level out. And then the United States is going to take long-term ownership of Gaza and turn it, presumably free of any Palestinian inhabitants, into the Riviera of the Middle East, Maragazo. And by the way, I saw some of the world's most insufferable lib commentators saying shit like, oh, wow, I'll bet all those Arab American voters in Dearborn who went for Trump feel dumb now. Those guys just got owned, which is honestly sickening almost beyond belief on multiple levels. First, I'm perfectly happy to give tactical advice about how to vote to anyone who, asked for it. But going beyond that to finger wagging and voter shaming has always been ridiculous. It's like that Bertolt Brecht poem, Die Lösung, where he's talking about the Stalinist ruling party in East Germany putting down a strike and putting posters around East Berlin saying that the workers will have to work twice as hard to regain the party's confidence. And Brecht asked, would it not be simpler for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? It's the job of politicians to appeal to voters, and I'd say that on any issue. I don't even like shaming just outright conservative-leaning voters who voted for Trump for straightforward ideological reasons, because frankly, it's our job as the left to get working-class Trump supporters to switch, to a better perspective by giving them a material program that won't peel off the most hardcore Trump voters. Nothing can do that, but it can at least peel off whoever's peel-offable. If you voted for Trump because of the price of eggs, instead of saying, now eggs are even more expensive, you morons, Democrats should have been pushing for policies to control inflation, or at the very least done a better job of naming and shaming corporate price gougers, like, in fact, Morena did in Mexico. That should be our focus. But it's particularly sickening to see that, you idiots got what you vote for stuff on the issue of Gaza, of all things, when the Biden-Harris policy was so grotesque. I've seen estimates where something like 95% of the population of Gaza was internally displaced, and even the most conservative estimates have something like, at this, that are all realistic, have something like 3% of the population killed, which is a scale of mass death that, as Americans, as people who haven't seen a war fought on our soil since the 19th century, we can't even begin to wrap our minds around. And the whole time, Biden kept signing the checks, Anthony Blinken kept providing cover to Netanyahu, and Kamala Harris never once so much as hinted that she'd do anything different, even after the warning from all those uncommitted votes in multiple states that were bigger than the margins that decided the 2016 and 2020 elections in those states. Even after warning after warning after warning, she held the exact same course and never broke from what the pro-Israel lobby in the Democratic Party wanted to hear. She didn't even let, famously, a Palestinian speak at the DNC. Basically, the Harris campaign took every opportunity to give people protesting the horrors in Gaza the middle finger. And after all that, you don't get to turn around and be smug about the fact that some of those people couldn't bring themselves to vote for you. And look, I say this as somebody who, sure, I wrote in Rashida Tlaib for president because I live in California. It's not exactly a swing state. It really could not have mattered less what I did. But if I still lived in Michigan, right, I would have held my nose, cast a lesser evil vote, and gone home thrown up. But the idea of getting mad at any voter who couldn't bring themselves to make that choice is just obscene, especially when you're talking about people, in Dearborn who might have actually had cousins who were murdered or dismembered by U.S. manufactured bombs in Gaza. It's just vile. But enough about the Democrats, because frankly, they've become irrelevant. They don't control anything. I want to talk about the people who do run every branch of the federal government right now. Let's roll that second clip of Trump when reporters start pressing him about whether the Palestinians, who he said would be removed from Gaza while he's leveling all the buildings and turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East, would ever be allowed to come back. Here's what he says.
Would Palestinians have the right to return to Gaza if they left while the rebuilding was happening?
It would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there. So if we can build them through massive amounts of money supplied by other people, very rich nations, and they're willing to supply it. If we can build something for them in one of the countries, and it could be Jordan, and it could be Egypt, it could be other countries, and you could build 4 or 5 or 6 areas. It doesn't have to be one area, but you take certain areas and you build really good quality housing, like a beautiful town, like someplace where they can live and not die. Because Gaza is a guarantee that they're going to end up dying. The same thing's going to happen again. It's happened over and over again, and it's going to happen again as sure as you're standing there, Peter. So I hope that we could do something where they wouldn't want to go back. Who would want to go back? They've experienced nothing but death and destruction.
Got that? The United States, on this proposal, would take long-term ownership of the single bloodiest conflict zone on the planet right now, expel every single one of the people who live there, and just hold on to power forever. And while all this is going on, Hamas will do nothing, Hezbollah will do nothing, the Houthis will do nothing, and all those Gazans never allowed to return home won't engage in any sort of armed resistance to that, the way Palestinians did after the first Nakba. let's be clear about this. What he's talking about, if it ever somehow happened in real life, would absolutely guarantee a war in the Middle East on a scale that, would dwarf what's come before in previous American wars. Of course, you can argue it's never going to happen. So what am I getting so excited about? Well, I'd make two responses to that. First, if it's not going to happen, it's going to be because there's so much outcry and pushback, primarily in the Arab world, but in all sorts of places. And I absolutely think that Americans should add their voices to that chorus. But second, the fact that Trump is even floating an idea like this tells you absolutely everything about who and what he is. The original premise of MAGA populism was twofold. First, that Trump and his movement were going to be America first. They weren't going to be like those neocons starting endless wars in the Middle East. Even playing with this idea about Gaza shows you exactly how serious Trump is about that. Second, these weren't going to be like the old Wall Street Republicans who pushed free trade deals and guest worker programs and left the Rust Belt to rust in the sun because Trump is an economic populist. And my answer to that would be the same as the therapist's answer to Carmela Soprano in the episode where Carmela decides to try therapy herself, and the therapist ultimately tells her he won't see her, but during their one session, she tells him that her priest says she should stick with Tony and try to make him a better man, and the therapist says, well, how's that going? As of now, this segment is going to be dated in about 3 hours. Things are moving so fast, but as of now, here's how MAGA economic populism is going. Elon Musk's pseudo Department of Government Efficiency is moving through the federal government, taking a wrecking ball to every regulatory body that's ever cost him $1. He's gloating on the platform he brought about how he's basically shutting down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He tweeted, CFPB, RIP. So these are the regulatory cops stopping credit card companies from milking you as much as they want to with nonsense junk fees. And then the Trump administration announced this morning that they're reversing two big specific CFPB BP policies, one on overdraft fees and the other banning companies from including medical debt in credit records. And as egregious as that is, in the long run, it's going to be small change compared to the other seismic shift, which is on the National Labor Relations Board. And I know a couple of internet Marxists who want to be edgy and contrarian. I've seen have this anti-NLRB take, like, oh, see, this is actually holding back some wave of worker militancy to have an infrastructure of labor protection, so we'll be better off. But I'm sorry, that's brain dead. Let's take a second to think about what a world without the NLRB might look like, because as of now, I just filed an article about this. That's the world it looks like we're entering. Right? So last Thursday, the NLRB announced its intention to essentially commit institutional suicide. Right? Because at the end of January, Trump essentially shut it down by firing one of its members, which the law very clearly says he can't do. But I think he made the calculation that he can at least get a lot out of shutting it down during however long it takes the courts to address this. And the effect of firing this member, Gwen Wilcox, means that the NLRB is below the quorum it needs to operate beyond any issues that can be handled by regional offices. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's SpaceX a while back filed this challenge with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit to rule the very existence of the NLRB, or at least its big enforcement powers, unconstitutional. And a few days ago, right, the board sent the court a letter saying, yeah, since we're below the quorum that we need to continue making decisions, we can't contest in court this challenge of unconstitutionality. And similarly, as this is happening, DOJ took aim at the Department of Labor, which, so that's the next target for the wrecking ball. And it certainly remains to be seen how either of these cases will play out. It's possible, as of now, that other interested parties will be able to defend the NLRB in court, and that despite the conservative supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court, the agency's existence will somehow be preserved. Whatever happens, though, it's clear that the Trump administration is waging a scorched earth campaign against organized labor that goes well beyond anything that Trump did the first time around. Back then, Trump did what any Republican would have done, right? As our friend and former guest Paul Prescott wrote at the time, right? Trump's appointees to the NLRB were delaying union elections, restricting the ability of employees to communicate about workplace issues, and enhancing the ability of employers to determine bargaining units, right? That's exactly the kind of people who would do all that stuff, are exactly who you would expect a Republican to appoint to the NLRB. But now Trump is going much further. He's going after the basic infrastructure that was won in the 1930s to protect the right of workers to form unions, right? So imagine that you're involved in an organizing campaign at your workplace and your boss comes up with some excuse to fire you. If that was spurious, right? This is a violation of the National Labor Relations Act, but any law is only as good as its enforcement mechanism. The NLRB routinely handles such complaints, and it often hands down rulings forcing companies to reinstate illegally fired workers with back pay. But if this happens to you after Musk's constitutional challenge to those enforcement powers goes through, and the agency is either abolished entirely or stripped of those basic powers, you might have to wait for years to get action through the regular court system. Even if the trial goes your way and then you get your job back with back pay, how exactly are you supposed to support yourself during however many years it takes for your case to get through the courts? Meanwhile, after your fellow workers have seen what you and your family went through during those years, how likely are they to take a similar risk? And this kind of assault on the fundamentals of workers' rights should certainly be enough to put to bed any idea that that anybody on certain corners of the left might have that there's been some kind of meaningful realignment on economic issues, not just in terms of who votes for who, but in terms of policy. But it's also maddening to see how little emphasis this issue has gotten by certainly the Democrats, who have, gone to bat for, USAID, in fact, often on the grounds that it's important for, countering Russian and Chinese influence. So, in a way that actually reinforces the Trumpist narrative that Trump is an anti-interventionist, and the Dems are neocons. And I'm not sure why Democrats would think that most ordinary Americans care about making sure the U.S. can engage in a sufficiently aggressive battle with China for influence on the internal politics of distant countries. But most Americans do work for a living. And there is a winning message here, right? So one of the things I want to talk about with tonight's guest, Vivek Chibber, is about how a lot of lefty or progressive type people, even some people who might think of themselves as socialists, aren't at all strategic about how they push back against the mudslide of horrifyingly reactionary initiatives pouring down from the White House and Mar-a-Lago right now. Not all responses work equally well. If the left just tails the liberal wing of the culture war or insists on, putting a plus wherever, conservatives, Republicans, and Trumpists put a minus, right? So people are even, it's like, oh, if they're against DEI trainings, we have to be in favor of, mandatory DEI trainings at work. That's just going to be a catastrophe. And parts of that discussion are simple, others are more complicated. But here's one part I'm absolutely sure of. If you want a effective anti-Trump message, this guy wants to make it easier for credit card companies to rip you off, and he wants to make it easier for your boss to fire you. It has to be at its center, right? All day, every day. Shout that from the rooftops. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.